Okay, it is April 10th, and I am Leah McBain, and we are here for our Newbury Veterans History.
We are, and I'm Bill McKinley, and I'm currently the chairman of the Newbury Veterans Committee, and looks like it's my turn, so here we go.
Well, let's start out, and you can tell me where you were born and a little bit about your background.
Well, I was actually born into the Air Force. My dad was a career officer, and he at the time in 1956 was stationed at a base in Italy, and I was actually born. He and my mother were married in Germany. He then got transferred to a base in Italy. And I was actually born in Germany at the Army Hospital outside of Ramstein Air Base. And the town is called Landstuhl. That hospital is still there. It's actually very famous when you hear about any of the wounded service folks or anybody coming back from overseas that needs medical attention in sort of the European Asian theater. They take them to that hospital now, even to this day. So it's still functioning. But yeah, I was there in 1956, and it was funny because my mother used to like to tell this story that there she is in a foreign country for the first time, and the doctors at the Air Force clinic at the Air Force Base said, "We don't have a maternity set up here, so you're going to have to go to Germany." And at the time, they were flying all the expectant mothers to this hospital in Germany from all over Europe. So they loaded her on a World War II vintage C-47, the paratrooper aircraft that is famous from the D-Day landings and all that. They load her up on one of these old C-47s and fly her to Germany from Italy over the Alps. And a few days later I was born, and they had no facility to keep people there. So when I was 4 days old, they loaded us back up on the C-47 and we flew back. My mother used to love to tell the story that she got on the plane. Back in those days, they had a row of seats along the left side of the cabin of the aircraft, and there was cargo on the right side of the cabin of the aircraft. And they had a rule back in those days that they issued everybody a parachute on the airplane. So they helped my mother. She just delivered a baby, and so she climbs into the parachute, and the co-pilot came back and said to her, "Ma'am, I'll take the baby if we have to jump." So I like to say that right off the bat, I was in an airplane and probably destined to be in the Air Force at that point. But anyway, so my dad was in the Air Force, and that was a big part of my early life in Arlington, Virginia. My dad was stationed at the Pentagon at the time. I started school there, and one of my favorite memories of that time was the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. I was attending, strangely enough, the William McKinley Elementary School in Arlington, Virginia, which was at the top of the street that we lived on, up a hill. And I remember that day clearly, even though I was in second grade. I was only 6 years old, and the teachers were running around crying, and it scared us. Mm-hmm. We didn't know why. We didn't have any idea what was going on. So they sent us home. And I remember walking in the door. My mother was sitting on the couch, and she was crying, and the television was on. And I remember distinctly the first thing I heard was, "Shots were fired at the president's motorcade from the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas." I've never forgotten that. And therefore, I am known far and wide as one of the world's great conspiracy theorists. It started when I was 6 years old. So there was that. But yeah, shortly after that, my parents separated. And my mother and my brother and sister and I moved to Pittsburgh, to her parents' home, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is really where I grew up. And went through high school there, and then went off to college to what was then called Slippery Rock State College in Western Pennsylvania. And I managed somehow to get through. It wasn't pretty, but I wasn't a very good student. Managed to make it. But I found myself halfway through my senior year in kind of a dilemma, because I had fallen in love and I wanted to get married, and my future wife was going to be an elementary school teacher, and she already had some interviews, so it was pretty clear she was going to get a job, and I didn't have one. I had had the just fantastic fortune of deciding to major in drama production and communications, which is a long way of spelling unemployment. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I wasn't going to have a career, and I couldn't imagine being married without that. So one day at school, this thought just came to me, and I said, I know the Air Force. I'll just join the Air Force. And initially, I thought I was just going to go down and enlist, and off we go. Now, this was shortly after Vietnam had ended. So there were a lot of veterans going to school on the GI Bill at the time, and Vietnam veterans. And they had an organization on campus. And so we would see them very often. And for some reason, a lot of them liked participating in the theater program. So I knew a lot of these guys. And they were talking about it. And to a person, they said, if you ever decide to go in the service, make sure you join the Air Force. Which I'd already decided anyway, but, it was nice to have the backup on that, I guess. So I went down, and I was graduating from college, and the recruiter said, we'd really love to make you an officer and send you to pilot training, which, of course, is what everybody wants to hear when they're going to join the Air Force. So I had stars in my eyes. And so I agreed to all this. And so I graduated, and I was going through the process of getting ready to go into the Air Force. At that time, Officers Training School, or OTS as they called it. They used to call it OCS, Officer Candidate School. For some reason, the Air Force decided they had to change the name, so they did. OTS was 90 days, and you may be familiar with the term the 90-day wonder. That's what second lieutenants were called who went through that program. So I was one of those. And I had to go, because I was trying to go into flying, they sent me to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio for a flight physical. So I showed up for the flight physical, and everything was going great. And I'd been in sports and everything. I played soccer in college, and I was in good shape, and I was running, and I thought, there's no big deal. I got this, no problem. Until we got to the eye exam, which the more people you talk to that go into the military, this is the one thing it seems like everybody has the same experience. Everybody seems to fail it. I don't know why. But they did the depth perception test. And back in those days, I don't know if you've ever had one, but the depth, it's all done electronically now. But back in those days, there was a box. And there was a little viewer on the box. And they told you to rest your head there, and you looked in the viewer. And there were two sticks inside the box. And they were attached to two sticks that stuck down underneath the bottom of the box. And the technician said, line the sticks up. So I'm lining the sticks up, and I said, there you go. And he looked, and he came around, and he said, you might want to try that one more time. So, he said, come here. And I walked around and looked at the side of the box. They were like this. He said, I'm sorry, you failed. So I was really disappointed. But then the recruiting people then said, hey, we need navigators. The Air Force was still using navigators at that time. And they said, okay, you can be a navigator. And I sort of, in a very flippant, happy-go-lucky way, without even thinking, said, sure. So off I go to officer training school, and I'm going to be a navigator. And officer training school was 90 days of what most people in the military refer to as Mickey Mouse stuff. You don't do it for any specific reason other than we tell you. And that's kind of what it is. It was really more of a psychological exercise. They wanted to see if you could handle the kind of jobs that Air Force officers have. So there was some physical stuff doing. I was kind of disappointed. I remember I thought they could have done better with the physical requirements. They weren't bad or certainly weren't worthless, but it wasn't as strenuous as I thought it should have been at the time. But I did well there, and so after 90 days, I graduated. I enlisted in the Air Force, officially sworn into the Air Force on October the 8th, 1978, and I retired on January the 9th, 2009. So that's a little past 30 years. Mm-hmm. And so off I'm going to go to navigator school. And there were a couple guys in my class that actually had been in my flight that were going in the same class to the school. So we thought, oh, that's great. So we knew each other. And the one guy, Alan Gale, had been my roommate, and he had a car. So I went home on leave after I graduated, or after I was commissioned, and then I flew to San Antonio, met Alan. He had driven from Florida in a Triumph GT6, which, if you're not familiar with that car, it's the Triumph convertible, little British convertible sports car, except it has a hard top. That was the difference. One of the worst automobiles I've ever been in, without question. But we somehow made it from San Antonio to Sacramento, California, where the base was at the time, where they did navigator training. And off we go. And we're sailing along, and I'm having a great time in navigator training. And the other guy from my flight, I shared the kitchen with in the officers' quarters. And one day, this is one of my favorite. It's in my top 3 favorite stories from the Air Force. What we would take turns go. We shared a mailbox, and we would take turns going to the post office to get the mail. And it was my turn one day. I went and got the mail, brought it back, and his name was Kurt Graby, and he was from Indiana, Pennsylvania. This is very significant. So I get the mail and hand him his mail, and I had my own reading a letter from somebody, and he comes through the kitchen, which was in between the bedrooms that we had. He comes through the kitchen and he says, "Hey, I thought you might want to read this letter I got from my Uncle Jimmy." And I said, "Okay." So I read the letter. It was very short. "Dear Kurt, so glad things are going well for me in the Air Force. I know you're going to have a great career." That kind of a letter from home kind of thing. So I get all finished, and at the bottom of the letter, "Love, Uncle Jimmy." Okay. I said, "Oh, cool. Well, that's great. You heard from your Uncle Jimmy." He said, "Look at the envelope." So I looked at the front of the envelope, and there's a address label stuck on a return address label stuck on the envelope. "Brigadier General James Stewart, United States Air Force, retired." His uncle was Jimmy Stewart, the actor, who had been a flyer in World War II, that kind of thing. It was wild. It was a wild time. Well, we're going along, and navigator school went fine, and I was fine. I was up at the top of the class with everybody. I had parachute training, which is about one of the worst things you can do. Oh, the only thing worse than that is water survival training, which is really horrible. And so we're going through all that stuff, and the academics, everything's going great, until we got to this navigational sort of examination. Now, I should backtrack to college. To say that I'm not good at math is one of the great understatements of the universe. And all navigators do is math. So up to that point, I didn't realize that I was really in the wrong place. And so we got, and part of this examination was flying. And back in those days, the Air Force used an aircraft called a T-37, which was a side-by-side trainer. Most of the old training airplanes were in tandem. And by the way, just fair warning, I'm an Air Force guy. We do this. So but this one was a little jet side-by-side trainer. So I'm told, as the other guys were told, to show up with my flight gear on, show up at the operations, such and such a time, and I'm going to meet some pilot, and we're going to go fly. That's all I'm told. So we get out there, and this guy comes out. I was still a second lieutenant, and this guy that came out, the instructor, was a first lieutenant. And to this day, I am absolutely convinced that he was absolutely bombed out of his mind and severely hungover. I mean, I could smell it on him. It was bad. He hadn't shaved. It was bad. But, there you are, you're a second lieutenant, and, mostly you say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and that's how your day goes. So off I go and get in the plane with this guy, and we take off. So that was kind of fun. Enjoyed the flying. It was cool being in all the gear and, oxygen mask on and all, and helmet and everything. It was really fun. And we're flying along, and he says, okay, you're going to navigate the mission. And I turned to him and said, excuse me? And he said, well, you're supposed to navigate the mission. And I said, well, they didn't tell me that. I didn't bring any of my, they just told me to show up. I found out later on that it was a, what would you call it? Sort of a hazing thing, sort of, Anyway, so this guy got really, really nasty, and I'm not going to give you his name, but this guy got really, really nasty. And I got mad because we had now crossed over into unsafe land, and I was, really. So then he decided he was going to try to make me sick. And it didn't work, but he tried. So we land and get out of the airplane, and we're doing the post-flight check of the aircraft, walk around the airplane. And I walked up to him and I said, you're drunk, and I'm going to see the flight commander right now, and I'm going to report you. And then he stopped being mean, and all of a sudden it was, kind of thing. And I did. I went right to his boss's office. And I'll never forget this guy. One of the nicest human beings God ever put on the face of the earth. He was a captain. Dennis Carusis, his name was. And I walked in and told him what happened. And he kind of knowingly nodded, like, yeah, I know this guy. He's a jerk, And I thought, okay. And he said, you're not really cut out for this navigational stuff, are you? And I said, no, sir, I'm not. And he said, do you want to stay in the Air Force? I said, I do. He said, I'm going to find you a job. Be back here at 7 o'clock in the morning. I left. It wasn't until years later that I realized what they were doing is they wanted to get me out of there before I actually filed a formal complaint. Mm-hmm. It never occurred to me at the time. Anyway, off we go. So I went back to see him. He says, I got you a job. You're going to Panama City, Florida. You're going to be whatever an air weapons controller is. He said, I don't know what it is, but that's what you're going to be. Sound good to you? I said, does it involve airplanes and stuff like that? He says, yep, it does. I said, good, sign me up. I'll go. I had no idea. And off I went. And I went to controller school and in Panama City, Florida, at Tyndall Air Force Base. And air weapons controller, the job now is called an air battle manager. Essentially, the job was using radar and radios to control combat aircraft against enemy combat aircraft or enemy ground positions. So we used to call it the world's greatest video game. And because of all the training I had at navigator school, I sailed through the weapons. It was nothing compared to the navigator school thing. So that really rolled along. And left there. Now we're into 1979. And somewhere in that process, I got engaged to a girl that I'd fallen in love with, my first wife, Michelle, in college. And the wedding was being planned while I was out in California, and then I went directly from California to Florida. I didn't go home in the interim, so the wedding's still being planned, and I not in on it, have no idea what's going on. I'm just showing up at some point. So we get to the weekend for the wedding. It's the Friday morning, and I had a plane ticket to fly home to Maryland, and I walked in and told the operations officer in the squadron. I was a student at the time. I'm flying home today to get married. He said, no, you're not. And I said, yeah, I am. And he said, you can't go. I'm ordering you not to go. And I said, okay. Yes, sir. And I had a buddy of mine drive me to the airport, and I got in the airplane. I was AWOL. You know, I don't know. I don't know what the statute of limitations are on some of these things, but I hope this one's passed by already. But anyway, off I went, and got married on Saturday night. Flew home Sunday afternoon, or flew back to Florida Sunday afternoon. And Michelle was teaching school at the time. This was in early June, and about 3 weeks later, she and a friend of hers drove all the way down to Panama City, Florida, from D.C. And and I had rented an apartment, so we started. I was a student at the school, and we started our married life together at that point. Luckily, if we've had some sane guidance somewhere in there, it probably would have been better, but we didn't. Anyway, but from there, my first base was at Hancock Field in Syracuse, New York. And if you've ever flown in and out of Syracuse, the airport there is called Hancock Field. That's the name. But during World War II, it had been a bomber base. And it was a transfer base where they would gather the crews for the bombers, fly them to Newfoundland, and then from there over Greenland and into Scotland, and then eventually to their bomber bases. And that was at that time, that was the Northeast Air Defense Center in a system called SAGE, S-A-G-E, which stood for Semi-Automated Ground Environment. It was the first computerized, built in the 50s, first computerized air defense system in the world. And so I was there for 3 years. My first son was born there. It was quite the time. Some funny things. I think probably the craziest thing that happened, I was controlling 2 airplanes out over the ocean south of Long Island, and at night. And one of the pilots came on the radio and said, we've got a surface contact. I want to go down and check it out. And he came back and he says, definitely something there. It's a large ship. I'm going to go down, and in pilot vernacular, he said, I'm going to drop the gear, meaning basically he was turning on his headlights, the landing lights, so he could see. And he and the other guy dropped down, and they dropped their landing gear, and he came back up and he said, yep, positive identification, 1 Soviet ballistic missile submarine sitting on the surface south of Long Island. And we had, back at that time, they had these red telephones in the operations room that you picked it up and it rang at NORAD headquarters at Cheyenne Mountain out west. And I had never heard that much telephone activity in my life. I mean, it was unbelievable. Total panic, And so that was kind of a wild day. But it was a good place. I loved living there. Loved Syracuse. One of the reasons why we now live in New Hampshire is because I love the country around central New York, and especially the winter. So that was kind of a big deal. So from there, I was sent to Korea for a year, and my wife and son moved back in with her parents in Maryland. And I was off to Korea. I was at a radar station called Yeongmunsan, which means Dragon Gate Mountain in English. And it was in the smack dab in the middle of the country, about 25 miles south of the current demilitarized zone. So if you're familiar at all with the geography of the peninsula of Korea, Seoul was, the capital was about 30 miles to the southwest of us. And the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, was about 40 miles or 50 miles to the northwest of where we were. But we were pretty close to the bad guys up there. And that was I hated being away from my family. I didn't handle it very well. Meaning it kind of got me down, a lot of the guys were married and had kids, and it wasn't that big a deal for them, but it was that part of it was difficult for me. The work was wonderful. It was kind of like being in the gunfight at the OK Corral every day. We had, and again, there were crazy things that went on, and on a daily basis. I think probably the worst thing that happened when I was there. And keep in mind now, this was 1982. Korea was a much different place then. Their government was much different. At that time, the government changed over because somebody got assassinated. You know, it was a tough place to be. Wonderful people. At that time, they were tremendously pro-American. I worked with some older guys in the Korean Air Force who fought in the Korean War all those years later, and they couldn't do enough for us. It was so there were some really great things about the place, and the work was great because we were so busy that the days would go by just like lightning. So that part of it was really good. I think the worst thing that happened is one day the commanding general of the Korean Air Force made a surprise inspection stop. The site was actually belonged to the Korean Air Force. It wasn't a U.S. Air Force place. And he came in a helicopter, unannounced, and landed on our chopper pad. And the Koreans went ballistic, and we didn't really have anything to do with it. But our commanding officer, who was a major, he didn't know anything was going on. And so there was no way to prepare for anything. There was no way, it was just bad surprise. So anyway, I was sitting there in the helicopter land. We knew I was on duty. The helicopter had landed, and we were just kind of going about our business. And the Koreans were running around with their heads cut off and all this stuff. And the next thing I know, one of the Korean officers runs up to me and he said, "You call dust off." Dust off is a U.S. Army aviation term for a medevac helicopter. It goes back to Vietnam time. And a lot of U.S. Army there, of course, and they had a lot of aviation, a lot of helicopters. And we had dealings with their medevac people before, helping to pick people up and get them where they needed to be and all that. So we were very familiar with it. So we're busy trying to. He didn't tell us why. He said, "You just call dust off." So we were calling the Army helicopter to try to get it in there. And another one of the Korean officers runs up to him and he said, "We have a very bad thing." And what happened? And about that time, one of our guys ran up and said, "The commander of the Korean Air Force got off that chopper." And we all said, "Oh my." We had no idea what was going on. And the Korean base commander had taken a Jeep down to pick him up. And when he was coming back up, there was an outer perimeter with a fence and an inner perimeter that guarded the radar and the operations buildings. They were coming to the inner perimeter, and of course nobody had bothered to check to see what was going on with the guard, and the guy was asleep. And they pulled up, and the Korean base commander got out of the Jeep and walked up and saw he was asleep. He pulled out his pistol and shot the guy. And that's what the dust off was for. It was a very serious place to be. They were at war, technically, still are, all these years later. And that was a real shocker for us. We didn't, obviously we never treated our people that way, but it was absolute, and there was no arguing it, nothing you could do. So that aspect of it was kind of crazy. I don't down them. Obviously the guy didn't need to do that, but their circumstance was very difficult because they were on a daily basis. They were facing a gigantic army who wanted nothing more to come over the border and kill them. So there you go. You know, it was tough. That aspect of it was hard. But you know, I contributed my plenty of shenanigans while I was there. The best one was one day in the winter. I was walking around between the inner perimeter and the outer perimeter, and that base had been there had been battles fought on this mountain in the Korean War, so there were old gun emplacements and foxholes and stuff. And I was just out on a winter day, lots of snow, looking around, hiking around, and I walked along, and I was looking at these depressions in the snow where these gun emplacements had been. I thought, well, it's, you know, just interesting to me, the whole thing. Well, the next thing I know, there's this Korean soldier running down the road, and he's waving his arms at me, but the wind was blowing, I couldn't hear him, and he's waving at me, and he's going like this, and I thought, okay, what's going on here, you know? So I stopped. I'm standing there and I'm watching him, and he gets he's still on the road, but he gets near to where I was, and he's yelling something at me in Korean, which I don't understand. And finally, I do the international, what's going on? And this kid goes, boom! And I'm standing there, and I thought, I'm looking around, I thought, you're in the minefield. I was. I'd walk, snow was so deep, I'd walk right over the fence. And I was standing in the minefield. So I could tell you that the thing you've seen where you back out using the footsteps, it works.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. But that was a year. And then because I've been away, I had I had a choice of assignments then, and the best choice that I saw, because my oldest son was at that point about 2, and I wanted what we used to refer to as a controlled tour, which meant essentially it was a something stateside that you couldn't be transferred from for a minimum of 3 years. And I thought, you know, we need some stability after me being away for a whole year. So I took the assignment as an instructor in the same school that I had attended as a student. So we lived in Panama City, and that went along okay for 3 years. Our second son was born, and then it came around to assignment time, and the Air Force said, well, we can send you back to the NORAD, back to Air Defense Command, which would have been back to the same job I had before I went to Korea, and I didn't really want to do that. And the other option that they offered me was to fly on the AWACS, which at that time was brand new. So the AWACS is the big radar plane based on a Boeing 707 airliner, and they were new back then. And they were based at that time out of at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma. And I realized that I was going to be away flying. Now, it would have been a flying job, which would have been cool because I always wanted to do that. But I realized I was going to be away all the time. And I said, you know, I'm married. I got 2 young kids. They didn't sign up for this. And I made a decision that a lot of people had to make, which was, you know, is your Air Force career more important, or is your family life more important? What are you going to do? And I said, you know, the family wins hands down. So I left active duty and got into the reserve. And it was funny because when I told the guys I was leaving, getting off active duty, one of the guys said, you know, you're never going to make it on the outside. You're never going to make it. And it really made me angry. And I carried that around for a long time, that anger, you know. I'll show you guys, you know, kind of thing that, you know, it was a good motivator though, you know, I think. But anyway, so I had a job at Westinghouse Defense, which was at that time, near the Baltimore BWI airport. And we got a house, and so I had this job, it was good, you know, good pay and everything, and we're kind of rolling along. And I found out there was an opening at the reserve unit at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, which isn't very far away from there. So I went up and interviewed, and they hired me, and I went in and I became an aircraft maintenance officer, which turned out to be the best military decision I ever made. And I loved it. And I'd never been a maintenance guy or involved in that aspect of it. And I was really fell in love with it right away because I was working with people, and the mission of a reserve unit is to train. So we had a really well-defined purpose, which really made it fun, because just showing up, you were making your mission happen. It was that kind of thing. So it was really, really, really good. And ended up staying there for about 12 years. Did a lot of traveling during that time. And then another crazy windfall occurred. Somewhere along in those years, I had started learning how to play the bagpipe. And if I was going away anywhere on travel or anything like that, it was going to be for a week or so, I would take my bagpipe with me, and so I could practice when I was away. So they decided to send me. I got promoted to major, and they decided to send me to the command school, which at the time was at Warner Robins Air Force Base outside of Macon, Georgia. So I'm going to be there for about 3 weeks, and so I took the bagpipe with me, and off I go. And there I'm at the command school, and playing away one day, and somebody said, the Air Force Reserve Band, which is based here at this base, they have a bagpipe band. You ought to call them. So I said, okay. So I called up one day and I said, hey, I'm just down here for a school, brought my pipes. Could I come by? Maybe we could play together. So I go there, and a couple of guys were there, and we played a few tunes together and all this stuff. And my dear friend, who wasn't at the time, but became my dear friend, Jake Story, he was a senior master sergeant with the band, and he was the drum major of the bagpipe band. He comes up to me, looks at me, he says, sir, what are you doing here? And I said, I told him the story. I said, I just came over to play a little bit, that's all. He said, oh, okay. And he was really suspicious of me. So anyway, I finished that school, went back home, but about a month went by, and my phone rang. And at that time, I had gone through several defense contracting jobs. And at that time, I was working for a company, wonderful company, called Quality Systems Incorporated. Fantastic. Great job. And I was working at CIA headquarters, which was also a fantastic job. And how that all came about, I can't really go into, but I was sitting in, I thought I was in the luckiest work experience situation that you could ever be in, where I had this great job at Dover Air Force Base, and I had this wonderful job working at CIA headquarters with some of the most wonderful people in the world. And we had a wonderful house and a great community. I mean, I was just thinking, this is fantastic. And anyway, my phone rings in the office. Is this, the Major McKinley that was at Robins Air Force Base playing the bagpipe? I said, yes, it is. And he said, well, this is Senior Master Sergeant Story. He said, I'm just curious, what are you doing over 4th of July this year? I think this was like in April of that year, 98. And I put the phone down. I said, let me check my calendar. And I'm going, what's going on? So I said, yeah, I think I'm available. He said, would you like to go to Australia with us? I said, let me check again, And I put the phone on. I went, Australia? Oh, no. I said, yes, absolutely. And I called my wife up on the phone. I said, they want me to go to Australia. I'm going to be playing in the pipe band with the Air Force. It's amazing. So that started my 10-year period of time playing with the United States Air Force Reserve Bagpipe Band. And that was just phenomenal. Meanwhile, at Dover, you almost need a column thing to follow, like a grid to follow this, because it was a very complicated thing. So I had this civilian career. I had my Air Force Reserve career. And then as a sub element to the Air Force Reserve career, I'm playing in the bagpipe band with the thing. And I actually it's no longer true, but I held a distinction for a while. I was the only officer to ever play with an active duty Air Force band since Glenn Miller did in World War II. I've always loved that. It was kind of neat. Anyway, and the guys were great. We had a great time. And I had some wonderful experiences. I commanded a USO tour to Korea. Traveled to Australia a couple of times. We were the first bagpipe band to ever play on the Arizona Memorial in Hawaii, which was a very difficult thing to do. Traveled extensively in Europe, and all over the States. So it was a wonderful time. And along about that time, the following year, with the guys in the band, they called up and they said, okay, we're going to be in DC and we're playing for at the St. Patrick's Day luncheon for the Prime Minister of Ireland and the President, and at that time it was President Bush. And they said, you're going to be, and I said, yeah, great, sounds good. And so off they show up, and since I was local there, I stayed, and so we get together. And the night before we played a concert, and the night before the St. Patrick's Day thing, we played this concert, and right in the middle of the concert, the guy who was the commander of the band, wonderful guy, he announces to the crowd that we have a brand new member of our band, and he's actually going to be the featured soloist for the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Ireland, and it's Major McKinley. And I had no idea, and I'm standing on stage, and what? You got to be, and I went up to him later and said, Alan, you're out of your mind. What do you, he says, oh, you'll be fine. It'll be fine. Don't worry. So yeah, that was quite an experience. I actually did that several times over those years for President Bush, President Obama. President Clinton and President Obama as well. So it was fun. It was a fun time. The only guys I really from my entire Air Force career, except for one that I have stayed in touch with, are two of the guys from the bagpipe band. So that was really cool. And meanwhile, at Dover, my career is going along up there. I got promoted again, so now I'm a lieutenant colonel. I'm squadron commander. Wonderful job. Anybody that's been a squadron commander in the Air Force will likely agree that it's the best job that you can have in the Air Force. And I thought it was. I just really loved it. And I'm going along, but when I got promoted to lieutenant colonel, the commander job was for a major, and they had a rule back at that time that you couldn't be over grade. They had to move somebody, and with good reason, because they wanted, you got to get the senior guys out of the way so people can move up. So I got a call from a general friend of mine who had been my CO, Keith Merlin, really good friend, and he said, I got a job for you at the Pentagon. This was 2000. And I said, no, Keith, I'm not going to the Pentagon. I'm going to retire in a year. I have one more year to go. I'm going to retire. And he said, oh, come on, why don't you take the job? It'll be. I said, I don't want to be at the headquarters. I'm a squadron commander. I don't know anything about that stuff. He says, oh, you'll be great, And I sort of did. That was my first instance of realizing that I sort of already volunteered to do this, but just didn't know it yet. So I said, okay, I'll try it for a year. Well, showed up, office full of wonderful guys, really said the job was awful. And I hated it. I was making PowerPoint presentations for congressional staffers. And I hated it. It was a nightmare. And I remember calling my friend Keith on the phone and saying, I'm out of here. I'm going down to see the first day I can retire. I said, this is the worst thing in the whole world. He said, oh, I understand. Okay. You tried, whatever. And I said, okay. So I went down to see the administrative people, and they said, you can retire with a full retirement. You can retire on the 16th of September, 2001. And I said, okay, fantastic. That's my deal. And there I was, on 9/11, where all of us remember where we were and what we were doing. I was at CIA teaching a class. A knock came on the door, opened up the door, and this woman is standing there who I didn't know. And she looked at me and said, "You need to get to a television." And she left. So I grabbed the class. Our office was down the hall. We walked down the hallway, walked in. All the people in my office were gathered around the TV, and they're watching. And I walk up, and I'm watching the tower of the World Trade Center on fire. What happened? Well, somebody said they think an airplane went into it or something. I don't know, And my first thought was, no, somebody in a Piper Cub wouldn't cause that. I mean, I thought there's got to be something else. But nobody really had any idea. Anyway, while we're standing there watching this go on, 9:45-ish in the morning, we see the second airplane hit the other tower. And right at that moment, I knew something was really bad, and two, we were under attack. I said, I've got to get to the Pentagon. I got to get out of here. This is, So they evacuated us from the CIA headquarters. And I don't know if you're familiar with where that is, but it sits right along the Potomac River, up on a bluff sort of way up above the river on the Virginia side. And right along the edge of that bluff is where the George Washington Parkway is, which happens to run right past the Pentagon. So at this point, what we knew was that the towers had been hit. We were being evacuated. And we had been told that they thought there was another hijacked airliner that was they thought maybe targeting the CIA. Mm-hmm. So that's what was rolling through my head. So I get out on the George Washington Park. There's nobody there. And the reason is because the plane had hit the Pentagon by this time. Mm-hmm. And they'd shut all the roads down. But we didn't know that because the local news wasn't reporting it yet. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I got home, and my wife came home from school, and she walked in, and another one of these things that I'll never forget. She looked at me and she said, "Now I understand what you've been saying all these years." Because I'd been telling her, we're due, something bad's going to happen. This is a bad situation in the world. This isn't good. Mm-hmm. And we had gone through 90, 91, Desert Storm together. I'd been on active duty for a while, for that. So in those the years in between, the 9 years or so, or 10 years in between, there were all those things that occurred. It was just pointing to something happening. And anyway, and she walked out of the room. I was watching television, watching the news, and she walked out of the room, and I got upstairs, and she had taken all my uniforms and everything and packed them in packed all my gear, and I was, getting ready to go. I got my CO on the phone from the Pentagon, and he said, we're meeting at the TGI Fridays in the Springfield Mall in Virginia tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock because we couldn't get into the Pentagon. They had shut it down. Now, but at this point, we had all the other stuff we knew that had happened that everybody knows about. So I'll never forget that day. I drove up, walked into there's nobody in there except all the people from my office, civilians and military. And I still see, when I think about that, I still see the picture of them in the restaurant. And I walked in the door, and they all turned and looked at me. And the look on their faces, you can't describe it. I can't describe it. But I'll never forget it. And then that started active duty at the Pentagon. I was assigned to the Air Force Operations Center, which is in the basement. The other services have theirs as well. And since I was an aircraft maintenance guy, I worked under the 3-star general, the deputy chief of staff for maintenance and logistics, 3-star general. And at the time, the general was a guy named Michael Zettler. affectionately known as the Z-Man. And so there we are, and we're down in the operations center, and it's 12 on, 12 off, 7 days a week, and right off the bat, we realized that everybody down there was either a reservist or a National Guard, and then they had an active duty sort of commander down there, a colonel. And so we got all these reservists and guardsmen, and we had literally no idea what we were doing initially. And kind of struggled through that for weeks. And we finally started to get a grasp on what was going on, and the military, of course, had begun deploying to Afghanistan. They had begun all these things that happened during that period of time. So we were it was a crazy time. We literally were making up what we were doing as on a daily basis. I mean, there was no book you could refer to. One day, through all of that, a guy I had made friends with, Frank Gorman, one of the smartest human beings that God ever gave breath, one of the nicest people I ever knew, but he was a wonderful officer and just a brilliant guy. He came to me in the one day at work, and he said, something I'm going to talk to you about. And I said, okay. He said, well, the general's putting together this planning task force. We're going to do the plan for the deployment, what turned out to be Operation Iraqi Freedom. And this was in late fall of 2002. And I remember saying, Frank, I'm not qualified for that. I'm not the right guy. I'm a squadron commander. I'm not a logistics wizard. I don't know the systems. I don't know the terminology and all that, because it's a very in-depth system that the military uses to deploy itself. And and you got to know what you're doing. There's a lot of it, And I knew I didn't, so I just said I turned him down. I said no. And he kept after me in this conversation. And I said, look, Frank, I'm not the guy. He was a regular active duty guy. And I said, there's got to be some people. And he said, well, first of all, there really aren't. And second of all, you've already volunteered. I said, really? He said, yeah, the general wants you on the staff. And I said, okay, I guess I'm volunteering then. So once again, off I go into something I had no business trying to do at all. And we found ourselves on this planning staff. So we have a 3-star general directly in charge of it. We have 1- and 2-star generals under him from the various departments of logistics of the Air Force. And we're talking about aircraft maintenance, fuel, supply, that sort of stuff. And we're sitting in a meeting, and he's talking about what we were going to do, and it suddenly dawned on me, because everybody in the room was a reservist or a guardsman, except for the generals. And it occurred to me, I said, General, I just figured something out. He said, what? I said, I know why it's us. And he said, you do? And I said, yes, sir, because we're expendable. And he said, you're absolutely right, you are. That was a turning point in my attitude towards the military, that conversation. Because I had never thought that before, that we really are expendable. And it made a difference to all of us that not only were we expendable, but because we were actually reservists and guardsmen, whatever happened couldn't do any damage to our careers, because they had asked us to be there. It's not like we, it wasn't a regular active duty kind of career move. We were just there, which was kind of fun. But anyway, off we went, and it ended up being the best. If there could have been a better job than being a squadron commander, that was it. It was a fantastic job. We literally had the run of the general staff of the Pentagon. We could call up anybody we wanted to. 4-star general, chief of staff, joint chiefs of staff, any of the other services. If we called and said, we need to see the general, we were in. and it was wonderful. It was like having the world's greatest credit card, you know. And we had a great time. With it, and did some really fun stuff. Guy that there were two of us that were senior on this planning staff, and his name was Cliff Fisher, and he's funny, short little fellow, really nice. He was a minister in civilian life, and he was an ammunition officer in the Air Force, which we used to kid him about all the time. But one day, one of the guys who was our supply guru guy, great guy, Joel Morin, we're in this meeting, and he looks at the 3-star general and says, "Sir, we can't do this. We need another ammunition ship." And the general says, "You're sure?" And he said, "Yes, sir. We need another ammunition ship." He was a major, telling a 3-star general that we needed to buy a boat. Okay. And the general, on his call, looked at Cliff and I and said, "Go get me an ammo ship." "Yes, sir." So we called the defense transportation people in Charleston, South Carolina, which is at that time was where they had all these ships. And I got the guy on the phone and I said, "I need an ammo ship." He said, "Okay, no problem." He said, "Like the other one?" I said, "Yep." He says, "Okay, we got one for you." I said, "How much?" He said, $47 million. I said, "Sold." And Cliff and I walked down the hallway and said, "Did we just spend $47 million?" And I said, "I guess we did." That's what this job was like. It was just an amazing, amazing job. But the best part of it, we one day in a meeting were ordered that the Air Force would not have any casualties in the combat, which of course is ridiculous, but they were serious. And they wanted us to set up a system over there which would minimize any exposure of Air Force ground personnel to enemy activity. The air part we couldn't really do much about, but it was the ground thing they were worried about. So we had to figure out transportation and locations and all of the other things that were involved with that, and keep all of that away from the reach of the Iraqi military, which we did. And it's one of the things, it's probably the thing that I'm most proud of in my whole Air Force career, is that we had a grand total of 2 casualties in the Air Force in that operation. And it was an air crew in an F-15. They crashed into a mountain. They were both killed. That was it. We had no ground casualties. And I don't know how much we or I did that contributed to that. I'd like to think at least a little bit. But we had no casualties. So I believe that my decision in 1978 to join the Air Force was ordained for me to finally have that job in 2002 so that I could be on that staff and help towards that goal. And I think I really believe it. I believe that was the reason why I ended up in the military. My original reason was to get married, but the real reason was to eventually get to the point where I had that job. And had I said no to Keith Merlin, nope, I'm not going to the Pentagon, I never would have done it. Had I never gone to Dover, I never would have got promoted enough to get the job at the Pentagon. Had I never left active duty, I never would have joined the reserve. And I guess the message here, in my mind anyway, about my Air Force career was that literally none of it was ever planned. It was always me answering a question and trying to pick the right answer, and never really knowing until looking back whether I did or not. And my general, the finest officer that I ever worked for, Major General Ann Harrell. She was a career maintenance officer, and very good friend, and really funny. We hit it off. I laughed at everything she said, and the other guys she just cracked me up. You ever know anybody that just crack you up? It's just that person. She was like that. But she was the best, absolutely the finest officer. I never saw anybody operate as an officer in the military better than her. Just phenomenal. And the one time, I'll never forget this conversation. We were talking about stuff, and she looked at me. She said, "You do realize that you're the luckiest guy in the Air Force, don't you?" And I'd never really thought of it that way. And she said, "Look at all this stuff you do and you get to do." And I said, "Well, ma'am, it was never a plan." And she says, "That's what I mean. You're the luckiest guy in the Air Force." And I honestly feel that I was. That very, very fortunate. I wouldn't be here, here in New Hampshire if it weren't for that. So I can say with complete certainty that I owe everything that I am to the Air Force, without a doubt, absolutely without a doubt. So it was, I think if there are people considering, the military, very often the person will have an idea of exactly what they want to do, or not. I'm a wonderful example of the or not, and yet I had a fantastic military career that spanned 30 years, and it only spanned 30 years because stuff happens. Mm-hmm. And I found myself in a situation where I was going to go do whatever it was that needed to be done, whether it was going and getting a civilian job or joining the reserve or going to the Pentagon, whatever it was. I also, as a reservist, I have a very warm, big part of my heart towards for the reserve and the Guard. I'm a firm believer in what we used to refer to as the citizen soldier, as being something that I really recommend. And if somebody's considering military service, active duty is great. The reserve and the Guard is also great. You can have a civilian career. I'm living proof that you can survive for over 20 years with two careers at the same time. You really can. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's difficult, but I certainly wouldn't change it at all. And there are times when you're separated from your family and away from your civilian job, sure. But I think in the long run, the benefit and the advantages that you gain from that. I always said this, and a lot of employers will say this too, that they got somebody that's in the Guard or somebody that's in the reserve. They're fine with the idea, and there are laws in place to protect people now, which are really good. So you can have a civilian career, and most employers love the fact that they've got a military person in with them, and they support them, on what they're doing most of the time, not 100%, but most of the time. And I think that's something to concern too. The other thing is that anybody considering going into the service, the array of possible careers that you can have, it's finite, but it seems endless. And the idea, as I'm living proof of it, that you can actually, in the middle of the stream, you can actually change what you're doing and do something else, is also fantastic. And I had so much active duty time. My initial active duty stint was about just shy of 8 years, but I ended up with almost 15 years of active duty, and I had so much active duty that I have almost a full colonel's retirement now, which allows me to be here. So everything worked out, beautifully. But like I said, it was never intentional, at least by me anyway. So I loved it, and now I'm involved with the Veterans Committee here in Newbury, and it's priceless to experience the camaraderie that I have with these men and women. And they are they're wonderful people, and just all of the things that we share, just because we come from all the services in different times, but we all share, that basic fundamental thing is that we went off and did it. I mentioned that the turning point in my thinking about the military, realizing that I was expendable. I had never really looked at it, and I think a lot of that came from being a reservist, because I had a civilian life. It wasn't like I was on active duty and then I went to a civilian life and then that was it. I was in the military, civilian, military on a monthly basis for years, and it just becomes part of what you are. But your attitude towards your service changes when you're in that kind of situation, because it's not all the time. And so when you're in uniform, that experience is really concentrated, and you start to think about what you're doing in a much more patriotic way, I think. The Guard uses the Minuteman as their symbol, quite correctly. And we used to call ourselves citizen airmen. We were willing to go when the time came, and we did. In fact, thousands and thousands did. And I've always thought that that's the best way to serve. It may not be the easiest way, but when you know exactly what you're fighting for, it's a lot easier to fight for it. And that's what happens when you have that civilian life and the military life together. You leave home and you realize, you look back over your shoulder and say, that's why I'm doing this. It's that woman and those two little boys back there. That's why I'm doing this. So it's a different point of view towards patriotism and all that stuff. But like I said, I wouldn't change it for anything. And I do, in fact, owe the Air Force everything that I am. So I'll always be grateful for that.
And I guess you touched on it a little bit, but what would you say was the best part of the Air Force, and what was maybe the hardest?
Absolutely the people.
Yeah.
This is something you hear repeatedly from most people that talk about their service. For the most part, I can't really put a percentage on it, but the vast majority of the people that I served with, and people who served under me, are the finest people that this country produces. It's a privilege to work with people like that. And without a doubt, I mean, the best thing about the service are the people. Everybody knows why they're there. Everybody's trained in a skill. Everybody has a sense of mission accomplishment. And everybody understands that the individual role that they have, that their commanding officer has, that their sergeant has, they understand why those things are the way they are, and they thrive in that kind of environment, which you cannot do in any civilian position. Not that I didn't work. I worked with wonderful people in my civilian jobs too. Still great friends with those folks from back in those days. And I loved those jobs, and I loved being at the CIA. That was most people don't really understand it. They have too many movies in their minds about how it really is. But back at that time, I got a chance to work with people whose intellect you can't even. I'm not that smart. They're just you stand there in awe at these people as they relate their thought process to you. It's just amazing. But definitely for the service, the absolute best thing about the service is the people. On the flip side of the record, because I'm guessing you're going to ask me this, I'd have to say, for me, the worst. Like a lot, everybody in that certain, nobody rolls through a 30-year career perfectly. I mean, I made mistakes and, did a couple of dumb things. Not that many, because I managed to stay around for 30 years, but I did a few dumb things. But everybody kind of does, especially second lieutenants. They're notorious for doing dumb things, and I filled the bill there. But I think the worst thing was when I had to take action, disciplinary action. A lot of people would say they hated the family separation part, and I did, but you survive that, and your kids survive it, and it's okay. But when you're in a circumstance where you can affect a person's life, and you're left with no, alternative but to affect their life somehow negatively. It's hard to look a person in the eye and do things like that. I think that was probably the worst thing for me. Fortunately, we had one of my favorite things of all time. I wish the civilian courts signed up to this. I really do. But the military justice system, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, as they call it, is without a doubt one of the finest institutions. And the reason is because as a commanding officer, you don't have to ruin somebody's life by prosecuting them in a legal proceeding to get their attention. Which means the Air Force retains a valuable asset. And you help a person see the path they need to take. But it's hard to go through those things. And that was probably I hated being on combat crew when I had to stay up all night too. That was terrible. I wasn't good at that. But yeah, I would say but the system is really good. There are things that people don't, they say about the service and they don't really understand. For example, you'll hear people say, there's a glass ceiling for women in the military. Totally untrue. It was untrue the entire time I was in. So going all the way back to 1978. So from that point forward, I never saw that. Ever. I never saw people being mistreated arbitrarily. Ever. That idea that there somehow is prejudicial behavior. I served with every single flavor of human being that there is. And I growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a very bigoted home. So my foundation, when I went off to college, as far as that stuff was concerned, wasn't very positive. But you get in the Air Force and you discover very quickly that the person next to you is there because they're good at what they do. And you realize that that's all you need to care about. If you're lucky enough to be friends with them, that's a great benefit. But they're there because they know what they're doing. And that's as far as it goes. Now, I served with a few jerks, both men and women, all the races, whatever. whatever it is, but it's a tiny number. And the military is a way of weeding them out eventually, and it does. Sometimes you have to be a little more patient than you want to be, but it happens. And I saw that too. Certainly, no institution is perfect, but I think the mechanisms are there in military service that you can aspire to do almost anything. And I think and it doesn't matter who you are, what you look like, or what sex you are, or anything. It's the modern military is smart enough to provide for all of that, So I would say that was probably the toughest thing. And being away, that's hard on everybody all the time, but that affects everybody. So it's not really, they're not doing that to you because they hate you. That just happens. And so I can't really point at that, but that would be it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we always ask if you had one message that you wanted to share with future generations, what might you say?
I think two things that are sort of parallel. One, if you're leaving high school or college and you know exactly what you want to do, going to college, or I want to be a doctor, great. If you don't, if you're not really sure what you want to do, I think what you should be thinking about is performing some kind of service to the country. The return on that is that you get an opportunity to figure out who you are and what you want to be. But the key to it is the who you are part. That's what the service really gives you. A lot of people will say, oh, it's dehumanizing. I mean, look what they do to the Marines when they go to basic training. They shave their heads. Well, they don't shave the women's heads, but they shave their heads and they scream and yell. And again, Hollywood, has twisted the truth. Most of that stuff that's in the movies no longer exists. Basic training is difficult for a reason, because being in the military is difficult. And it requires your focus and your attention and your ability to perform under difficult circumstances. And it doesn't matter whether you're a computer programmer or a Marine infantryman hitting the beach. It makes no difference. You're still in difficulty all the time. So what it does, and what military service does, and it did for me, certainly, it allows you to realize, and it promotes you realizing what you're really about. So it's actually the opposite of dehumanizing. It's actually the most human thing in the whole world, because it's teaching you who you are. Years ago, a sergeant asked me, why do we have to get our hair cut a certain way? Why do we have to wear a uniform? I said, you know what, I'm going to think about it. I'm not going to give you an answer like, because it's in the regulations. I'm actually going to think about this. It is in the regulations, but there's a reason why. And I thought it over and I realized what it was. Your hair's a certain way, you wear your clothes a certain way, you wear certain clothes. You perform certain ritualistic things like saluting or marching or responding to your superiors with, yes sir, no ma'am. You do all of those things because the military doesn't want you worrying about that stuff. They want you focused on your job, focused on performing the mission. That's the only thing that matters in the service. Now, the service doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They don't disregard the human side of it, because you have to have human beings to have a service. So they're not ignoring the human side of this whole thing and just saying, well, the mission, it's just the mission. But what you find out about yourself, like I did, is that, yep, you're expendable, and yep, the mission comes first, absolutely, because that's what you're about. You figure out what you are, and you can't figure that out unless you are providing service to other people. You just can't. And I think so to that end, what I would tell people is, and there are other material advantages. For example, here you are in New Hampshire. You don't have enough money to go to college. You're graduating from high school. Join the Guard. Of course, I'd like you to join the Air Guard, but the Army Guard's fine too. Or join a reserve unit. There are Navy reserve units, Marine Corps reserve units, Air Force, Army, Coast Guard. Join the reserve. Go to basic training. Get a job. They'll train you. They have to. It's a law. So you have a skill. Now, your friends who graduated from high school, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to hang around in the house with mom and dad, and frankly, if mom and dad let them do that, there's a bigger problem there than I can solve for them. But they're going nowhere. They're not getting anything. They're not moving along. So if you go into that situation, you don't have to go active duty, although there's nothing wrong with that either, because you can still get your education there too. But in the Guard, what's cool about the Guard and Reserve and active duty, it equates. While you're serving, you can go to school, and they're going to pay for it. So that when you graduate, you have a job in the Reserve or Guard or active duty. You have your associate's or 4-year degree, or if you want to go past that, grad degree. And by the way, they will pay for medical school and law school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go a long way and do a lot of things. Yes, it's going to take some years for that to happen. Absolutely. In the meantime, you're gainfully employed. You're not a burden on society. You're serving the country. You're serving your state if you're in the Guard. So you're serving the people of your state. You're serving the people of America, and you're figuring out what you're made of. Find a civilian job that does that for you right out of high school, and I'll never say this again, because you can't do it. I think it's the best deal there is. So I would certainly encourage, and right now we have an all-volunteer force. We don't have a draft. I get asked this question all the time. Do you think we should have a draft? And I say, no, I don't agree with it, because I don't want jerks in my Air Force. And that's what would happen if we had a draft. I don't want that. I want good people who want to be there in my Air Force. I want volunteers, because those people can be trusted. And if you're going to put jets up in the air, you better trust the people who are fixing them. So, that would be my message. Do something. Now, if military service isn't your gig, there are other things you can do that provide service to the country while you're figuring out what's going on. And the beauty of all of those things, whatever they are, for the most part, the government's paying for it, so it's not coming out of your pocket, and they're going to educate you. Hand in glove, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, that's what happens, and I think if this project, the interviews, are really an important part of what goes on here, if for no other reason that people can see normal human beings who just live in our community that have gone out and had a chance to do some wonderful stuff.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.